We're now able to register new users with the help of our register form. However, we're not telling users when they register successfully that they are in fact registered. So our approach now is going to be to display a pop-up, to display a modal that's going to tell users that first of all they are registered successfully, and second of all that after registering they need to log in. Through the process of logging in, they'll be able to get their JSON Web Token and we'll be able to authenticate them into the app itself. So the first step will be to create this success dialog. We'll do so underneath our paper component. We'll make a success dialog area. So this is going to consist of a dialog component, and it's going to have the prop on it disable backdrop click set to true, meaning they can't get rid of this dialog by clicking on the background. Next we'll add a dialog title with a dialog title component. This will contain the text new account, and to the left of the text we're going to add an icon, a verified user two-tone icon with the class name classes.icon. Then underneath the dialog title we'll have some dialog content. Then within dialog content some dialog content text, which will say user successfully created. If you want, you could interpolate the username value that we have stored, but I'll just make it generic. Then underneath the dialog content we'll have some dialog actions. So dialog actions is going to include a button that's going to take them to the login component. So this button will have the color primary and the variant contained with the text login. Now the first thing to take care of is we want the user to actually go to this component when they click on the login button. So how are we going to achieve that? What we can do is within index.js, within our auth folder, we'll create some state and allow users within the register component as well as within the login component to update that state according to whether they want to see the login component or not. So first of all, to create state within a function component, we need to bring in useState, and this piece of state will be created once again by executing useState, and it has to be up at the top of our function component that we're using it in, above our return. useState is going to have a default value of false, and you'll see why in just a second. The values that we are going to get back are going to be declared once again with const, and we're going to put false in a variable called new user, and the setter will be set new user. So by default, when this auth component is shown, new user is going to be false. Or in fact, let's make it true. So if we have a new user, and by default we will, then we're going to display the register component. Obviously, a new user has to register before they log in. So to make sure that we send them to register, we'll add a ternary. We're going to return new user, question mark, where if new user is true, then we're going to send them to register. Otherwise, we're going to send them to log in. So now what's possible in order to update new user, to render login, is we can pass down our setter, set new user, to register. So we'll create a set new user prop on register and pass through set new user. Then within registers props, in addition to destructuring classes, we can grab set new user, and then down at the bottom on our login button within our success dialog, we'll add an onClick, where if they click on this, we'll provide an inline arrow function once again and take set new user and pass in false, thereby running this auth component once again. When the state updates, new user will be false, and according to the ternary, they'll be taken to login. So the next thing to take care of is actually opening this dialog when our user is successfully registered. First of all, Dialog is going to be opened only when a prop on its opening tag called open is set to true. So we need to create an open piece of state and set this accordingly. So we'll create open with useState once again. So we'll have open and set open. And open is going to have a default value of false. We're going to want to turn this to true when they've successfully registered. So only after our user successfully created do we want to open the dialog. So when we get a response back, when we get a response back, we'll say set open and pass it true. This is one logical way to handle opening the modal, opening the dialog. Another way that we can use that I'm personally going to go with is adding on to the mutation tag a new prop called onCompleted. OnCompleted is a callback function that's executed whenever our mutation successfully completes. So instead of having to create an async function here within handle submit, we can remove it and we can get our response data here within onCompleted because that's what the parameters of the callback function gives us. So within onCompleted we get data, we get our response. So we can still console log that in a success case, but we can also set open to true here as well. So it cleans up our handle submit function. So our dialog is going to be opened when open set to true. There's two more things left to do. The first is to display any errors. We'll do so before the closing tag of our form. We'll improve our error handling in the future, but for now we're just going to have a conditional where we say if we have an error, we're going to say and, which will return and display the next piece of JSX that we'll add. If there's an error, we're going to display a div with the simple text error. As for the loading state that we also get access to, we want to disable our button, disable our submit button whenever we're in a loading state, in order to not send off the same data twice to a mutation. So we will take the submit button and add the disabled prop to it, and it should be disabled when loading is set to true, but we can also disable our button until all of the fields in our form are filled out. So if the email input was empty, for example, that should in itself disable register. So we can add a conditional where we disable it if loading's true, or if username, password, username, email, or password don't evaluate to true when they're converted to a Boolean. So we can say or not username, or not email, or not password. With this, one thing's important to keep in mind, however, when we save this and try typing in username, email, and password, we see the register become clickable. However, this doesn't cover the case for when there's white space provided. So I'm just hitting the space bar. I'm not actually providing a password, but we can still click the register button. So to prevent this, to remove any white space, we can say not username.trim to trim off any white space, as well as not email.trim and not password.trim. So when we save that, if we provide spaces to each of these inputs, we still don't see the register button become clickable. We might also want to change the submit button text when we're in a loading state. So we can add a ternary and say, instead of just having the initial button text register, we can say if loading's true, we'll include the text registering, otherwise the previous text of register. And the very last thing that we can take care of, which is more of a presentational improvement, if we head down to the success dialog, we can actually make our dialog transition in very easily by adding to the opening tag transition component and setting that to a component that we'll create in just a second called transition. So we can make this transition component above our register component. And it's very simple with Material UI using the components that are being imported. We'll create this component with a function declaration using the function keyword to kind of separate it from register. We'll call this transition, and the transition component gets access to some props, and all we need to do is just return this slide component, where the only prop that we need to set is just what direction we want the dialog to slide in. To make it slide up, we can include the text up, or it can slide from the top down, I believe also from the left or the right. So it's totally up to you how you'd like to make it appear. All we need to do is just use an object spread here to spread in props, the props that it has access to. So finally, let's save both index.js and register.js, and we'll try registering a new user. So I'll add the username Joseph, email joe@gmail.com, and the password Joseph. And when we hit register, we should see our dialog pop up, and it does. So we still get our data returned from our onCompleted callback with our successfully created user. We saw our success dialog slide up with our transition component. We see new account, user successfully created, and we have this login button. So if we click on login, we should be taken to our login component, and we are. For now, we just see the text login, but we'll fill this out in just a second. And just before I forget, remember that we had another button right next to our submit button for taking our user to the login component. Well, now we can add a onClick to that button. And just like for the login button on our success dialog, we can write an inline function and call setNewUser and set it to false. So when we save and we click on the login here button, we're immediately taken to login.